Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Ben Dubose here, Paolo Alves there. Thanks for tuning in to another new episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. You can follow me on Twitter/X at Ben Dubose and Paolo at Paolo Alves NBA. You can also follow my Rockets coverage at USA Today's The Rockets Wire and at Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of the team. As we chat this Thursday, October 17th, the Rockets will wrap up their preseason slate tonight at home against San Antonio. Jack Landale, who had a very long summer with the Australian national team at the Olympics, is the only guy who technically won't be available, and it sounds like the Spurs, at least for a half, will have Wemby playing. However, my suspicion is that both teams are probably going to be fairly vanilla, maybe have backups in by the time the second half rolls around, because this is a unique circumstance. Not only is it the last game of the preseason, when teams tend to be a little more risk-averse when it comes to potential injuries, regular season is less than a week away, but also there's a unique quirk here where the Rockets and Spurs play 3 times in the first couple of weeks of the regular season. So because of that, I think both teams will sort of attack and defend much more vanilla than they would if it was an opponent they won't see for a while. So with that in mind, I think most of the relevant data points this preseason are already in. As we're recording this, the Rockets are 2-1 in exhibition play. They lost their first game in Utah when they were minus 15 in rebounding. Then they won their next 2 at Oklahoma City and earlier this week at home versus New Orleans. Rockets were actually +9 and +15 on the glass in those games. So perhaps that's one key variable. We'll probably touch on that as we make our way through this episode. It should definitely help when Steven Adams and Tari Eason are both available at the same time and in the same game, which tonight's preseason finale should actually be the first time that will be the case. Both of those guys obviously were somewhat load managed throughout training camp since they had season-ending leg surgeries last year. Both should be fully cleared by the regular season. This is just part of a slow and steady build-up, which was always the plan. We already knew that going in. Anyway, as far as today's format, each of us are going to share one area of encouragement from the preseason, one area of potential concern, and then, as we did in last week's show, we'll have a few rapid-fire notes on the rest of the roster as we close things out. Think of it as 3 segments. But before we dive in, let's start with the obvious question. Paolo, where does the Jack McVay buzzer beater against the Thunder rank on the all-time list of Rockets buzzer beaters?
I would say probably right below the Gerald Green one against, I can't remember.
Phoenix.
Was it
Phoenix.
I was about to say the Suns, but I thought that was Eric Gordon's. No, Eric Gordon's was Philly. All right.
He also had one against the Lakers that tied the game before the Rockets won in overtime. Eric Gordon had 2. But yeah, the walk-off was Eric Gordon in Philly and then Gerald Green against the Suns, yeah.
Yeah. And I think I saw a lot of people on Twitter making Garrison Matthews type comparison and saying that he might get playing time or that he should have a roster spot. I'm like let's. I know we don't shoot very well, but let's relax a little bit. The guy's probably not going to see minutes the entire season, but it's fine. It's fine if people want to turn him into the people's camp for the season. That's fine, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. He's a 2-way contract guy at the end of your bench who does have one NBA-ready skill in terms of his shot. So if he's a new age Ryan Anderson that you can deploy in a pinch, there are worse things. No, I don't think he's going to be in the rotation barring significant injuries. But yeah, it was a great moment. And beyond the moment, I also think the clear camaraderie, the way his teammates were still engaged on the bench and rallied around him, it shows something about the culture that Ime Udoka is building. As far as all-time Rockets buzzer beaters, I think the top 2, you got to go back a while, would be Ralph Sampson in the 1986 Western Conference Finals and then Eddie Johnson in the 1997 West Finals. The Ralph Sampson shot actually sent the Rockets to the NBA Finals just the second time in franchise history. The Eddie Johnson shot, fun fact, I was actually at that game when I was just 13 years old, but Eddie's shot ended up, or technically I was 12, about to turn 13. But yeah, Eddie's shot tied the series, although the Rockets went on to lose to the Jazz. So those two, because they happened in the playoffs, in the conference finals, are, in my opinion, the clear top two. But after that, yeah, you've got shots like Gerald, Eric Gordon, Hakeem had a buzzer beater against the Mavs the season after the 2 titles. So there's quite a few in Rockets history. Jack McVay in the preseason, probably not quite to that level, but it was a fun moment nonetheless. And it sort of did even out the record because the loss in Utah, we talked about that on last week's show, even though they lost, they probably deserved to win because they led comfortably for much of that game. And the result in Oklahoma City sort of offset that, and that the Rockets were trailing for a lot of that game, but ended up getting a win because their reserves outperformed the Thunder reserves late in the fourth quarter and overtime. So all's well that ends well. The 2-1 record through 3 games is probably reflective of the type of team the Rockets have going into this regular season, assuming health. Anyway, let's dive into actual...
Let me just... I had to double check this. We didn't mention Mario Ellis one, did we?
Well, that wasn't at the buzzer. You're talking about the kiss of death, right?
Yeah.
That was with 7 seconds left.
Ah, that's why you didn't mention. I knew something had to be wrong. I was looking it up right up to see what I was missing.
One of the amazing things about that, so everyone remembers the shot because kiss of death, it was a tie game in the closing seconds, and it was the ultimate no, yes, because you would think get the ball to your best player. Well, Mario Ellis open in the corner. In theory, it's the easiest 3. It's the shortest that there is. And so he said, you know what, if you're going to sag down to help double team.
Yeah, they did not guard him whatsoever.
Yeah, then I'm going to take this shot. And he made it. And beyond just that shot being so clutch, and you can talk about Rudy Tomjanovich being ahead of his time with their emphasis on spacing the floor. That was the year that Robert Horry was the original stretch for spacing it for Hakeem. The Rockets also then fouled up 3. And so the Suns never got a shot to tie the game. And that's probably why you think of it as a walk-off, because the Suns never did have a chance to actually tie it. I think they actually did get like one wild heave with like a second left, but it wasn't a realistic shot. The point is, after Ellie hit that shot with 7 seconds to go, the Rockets sent them to the line. It became, an exchange of free throws, and ultimately that's how you should play it. I know that's how Ime Udoka wants to play it. We saw it at times last season. However, the execution, still angry at Reggie Bullock for what he did in Dallas. Execution, for whatever reason, can be a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, I was about to say it's been 30 years and teams still have not got it done, right?
But yeah, 95, Rudy Tomjanovich was ahead of his time. And so that's why you probably think of it as a buzzer beater, because the Suns did not really have a realistic chance to tie the game afterward, thanks to how the Rockets played that. Anyway, transitioning to actual analysis here. And we'll start with the good, which is the area of encouragement. And there's a number of spots you could point to. I'm going to try and steer away from Jalen Green and Alperen Şengün, because for those people wanting analysis of those 2 players, obviously they're key storylines for the season as a whole, entering their 4th years in the NBA. We talked about them a lot on last week's show. So at least for me, I'm not going to artificially limit you, Paolo, but for me, I'm going to focus elsewhere on the roster for my area of encouragement this week. And the clear positive for me coming off that New Orleans game on Tuesday night is Steven Adams. On last week's show, I shared a little bit of skepticism because I thought defensively he wasn't moving that well in Utah. I did add the caveat that, look, it's his first game after missing a year due to knee surgery. He should get better. In my opinion, he clearly did get better. Statistically, made all 3 of his shots, had 11 rebounds in 15 minutes. But I just thought in general, he moved much better on the floor. He looked more fluid. Post-game comments from Ime Udoka talked about not just the stats, which are very good for a backup center, but that because of the attention he draws when he is crashing the glass, it opens up the game for other guys to get rebounds as well. And so we talked about Steven being the type of guy whose contributions go beyond the box score. I can also tell you that at practice, he's one of the most vocal guys on the court, probably the most vocal, right up there with Fred VanVleet in terms of being a veteran that's coaching all the time. He may as well be a player coach with how insightful he is and how helpful. His teammates already love him, even though this is his first year as a player in Houston. So I had a few concerns watching him in Utah. You always have to worry about a guy that's in his 30s coming off of surgery. Is he going to be able to move like he did when he was in his prime? I feel much better about that now, and the stats don't lie. He was outstanding against the Pelicans. And for me, the reason I'm encouraged about Steven Adams, it goes beyond simply having a quality backup center, which definitely was a need for much of last season behind Alperen Şengün. Jack Landale, who had hurt his ankle the previous offseason, got going late in the year, but by and large, the narrative had already been set, and even Jock Landale has limitations. Steven Adams, when right, is a starting quality center in the NBA, and he looked that this week against the Pelicans. So it's clearly an upgrade to this roster. It should help the Rockets be a better team. If something does happen to Alperen Sengun, where he turns an ankle or something along those lines, then Steven Adams can fill in and actually be a starting caliber center in the NBA. So there's lots to like here. But beyond that, what it made me think of is how it made their blueprint from the 2023 offseason, which was the pivot point for this franchise. It sort of made all of that come together, and it made that plan whole. We don't need to go back in time and relitigate everything that happened, but we know entering that pivot point, when the Rockets hired Ime Udoka, they had all that salary cap flexibility. The plan was to keep developing the young core, all these young guys, and then sign impactful veterans in free agency. And they had targeted 3. Fred VanVleet, Dillon Brooks, and Brook Lopez. They got 2 of the 3. We know what happened with Brook in terms of him reneging on and going back on his word and staying with the Bucks. But the idea was to sign all 3 of those guys. And when Brook went back to the Bucks, rather than give money to a guy who wouldn't have been as good of a fit for the role, the Rockets said, you know what, we're instead going to turn to guys like Jock Landale and Jeff Green, who are more likely to take team-friendly or trade-friendly, if you will, contracts, and are going to slot a lot lower in the hierarchy, like 9th or 10th man, more good vets for the locker room, those types of players, and not a clear rotation piece the way Brook Lopez would have been. And so fast forward to last season, when Alperen Sengun breaks out, there was a lot of talk of, did Brook Lopez going back to the Bucks save the Rockets from themselves? Because if you had both Lopez and Sengun, there would have been something of a timeshare arrangement at center. And I get the questions, especially in a season where Alperen Sengun did develop into an all-star. But what I will say is that the Rockets never looked at it along those lines. It was never a referendum of, do we believe or not believe in Alperen Sengun? They simply looked at Brook Lopez as the type of big man, defense first, that could be sort of the big man complement to what Dillon Brooks does on the wing and what Fred VanVleet does at point guard. It wasn't meant to keep Alperen Sengun from developing in much the same way that Dillon isn't keeping Tari Eason or Amin Thompson or anyone that's technically behind him from developing, and Fred VanVleet isn't going to keep Reed Shepherd from developing. If one of those guys gets to the next level and the Rockets need to decrease the minutes of the veteran, they're willing to do that, and that's a good problem to have. What the Rockets were looking for was culture setters who would help get them off the rebuilding treadmill. 3 straight 20-plus win seasons, or around 20, I should say. And so there's lots of bad habits. They needed to be competitive for the sake of development. Fortunately, even without Brook, the Rockets had enough between the young guys, Fred and Dillon, Jeff and Jock did some things as well, that they obviously did get to 500, and they became a competitive team anyway. But Brooks still would have helped. Look at last season. When things went off the rails, which was January and February, they were largely 500 or above until the new year started. And then Alperen Sengun, there was a little drop in his production, I think, due to the workload. He had some back issues. But regardless, it's a lot to ask of him in year 3. His production fell off a little bit, especially defensively. Fred VanVleet missed a few games. Tari Eason was lost for the year. And so they were well below 500 in January and February. They also had a lot of road games in that stretch, and it largely dropped them out of the postseason mix. Now, in March, they were fantastic. They had the 11-game win streak. They went 13-2. But that only got them back to 500 because of how much they had dropped before that. And so in a Western Conference where you need to be, in something in the range of 10 games above 500 to qualify for the postseason, it just ultimately was not enough. If you had Brook Lopez in the middle of that season, it might have helped. And the way the Rockets looked at Brook, again, it was never about how much they believe or don't believe in Alperen Sengun. The idea was that a defensive-minded big man is one of the biggest floor raisers in the NBA. If you have someone that can occupy space, protect the rim, defend that area, rebound, do the fundamentals, it significantly increases your floor. And for the Rockets coming off 3 rebuilding years, that was really, really important to them. And so because of that, even though I'm certainly not wistfully saying, if only they'd gotten Brook Lopez, no, I see what's happened with Sengun. At the same time, I understand why the Rockets made him a priority. The one, bone I will toss to the Sengun camp that's probably going to hear that and recoil a little bit it is fair to argue that if Şengün is looking over his shoulder, if his minutes are artificially capped in the 20 to 25 range, well, 25 to 30, I should say. I don't think there was ever a scenario where he's going to play 20. But if he's not given the runway that he had last season, yeah, it's fair to say, would he have developed, would he have felt as empowered as he did to take that All-Star leap? Okay, that's a fair argument that you can make. And so because of that, I'm not saying, oh, if only they had Brook Lopez. No, but what I am saying is that now with Steven Adams, it's almost like you have the best of both worlds. Now, I know Steven Adams is not a three-point shooter the way Brook was, and maybe there were a few lineups where you could have gone double big since Brooks can shoot, but that wasn't really the point of it for the Rockets. It was not about the 5 out or the shooting. It was about the defense. It was about the veteran presence. It was about the sheer size, a different type of big, as Ime Udoka has said in the past. And yet, because he would have been on a multi-year contract at $20+ million a year, there would have been some dicey politics in terms of giving Şengün the runway to develop and the 30 to 35 minutes per game he warrants now as a legitimate all-star candidate, while also giving Brook Lopez what he expects. As opposed to now, you have a somewhat similar type of player who can fill that role, who can dramatically raise your floor. Yet, because he's on a 1-year contract at $12 billion and coming off of knee surgery, Steven Adams is okay if he's just playing 15 to 18 minutes a game for most of the season in a way that Brook Lopez probably would not have been last year. So for me, it sort of brings the whole thing full circle in that while I don't think Brook Lopez was a major miss given the way things turned out and the leap that Alperen Şengün took last season, at the same time, I understand the blueprint. I understand what the Rockets were thinking, and there were some advantages to that. And now for me, it just feels like that if Steven Adams is healthy, that's the ultimate if you got to put on this, but if his knee is right and he's ready to go, then you have a lot of the benefits of that original plan in which you have that defensive big man to pair with Fred and Dillon as your veterans, yet you don't have any of the negatives, which are, what are the politics like with trying to develop Alperen Şengün at the position while still trying to satisfy, the veteran floor-raising type. So for me, that's where I get the source of encouragement. It's not just what Steven does in the micro. He's a very good player, but also the macro. I think he makes that plan whole. And so because of that, I'm really bullish on what we've seen from Steven Adams. And I think he could fill a role, not just in terms of what he can do this season, but also from the front office, really bring their vision from 2023 together. So that's my source of encouragement, Paolo. Any thoughts on that? And what's your area that you've sort of honed in on these last couple of games?
Yeah, touching on Steven Adams, I think he definitely brings you something with his screening that no other player in the league does. He's literally the best screener in the league, which has been obvious by how Jalen Green's been able to get open mid-range shots just all over the floor ever since, he, in the minutes that he shares with him. Just needs to make them, but that's a work in progress, obviously. And the other thing I'll touch on with Steven is when he first signed. I guess two things. When he first signed, for some reason, it felt like a bigger deal than it should have been. I don't know. Maybe I've just always had a Steven Adams thing that ever since he was back with the Thunder. Just not just from what he does on the floor, but just the personality, the sportsmanship. I mean, if you go on YouTube, there's just so many clips of Steven Adams. Just I think there's a very distinct clip, or there's two of them. There's one where Ja Morant's about to get into a fight with someone, and I think it's Tony Bradley, who's like a
I've seen this.
Still in the league, but he's a center, right? So he's not he's at least 6'8", which is a massive human being, and Steven Adams just picks him up like it's a child and carries him away from Ja Morant. And just the fight's instantly broken up, and Tony Bradley just can't do anything because what are you gonna do with Steven Adams? You don't want to mess with him,
right?
But he's that while also being a gentle giant, and there's multiple clips of him giving up on plays to Emper or not Emper to soften guys' falls when in plays around the basket. And there's multiple examples of this. So I've always been a Steven Adams fan. I think he brings a lot culture-wise, even if he didn't play well enough. And there's something to the guy who, was okay spending, 10, 15 million on a player last season on a 1-year deal just for them to be culture setters, who was, perfectly okay with giving Jeff Green, even though he's playing well enough, but giving him 10 million a year just to be the locker room guy, because I thought that was really important. The other thing that I would mention is those mid-range shots that Jalen Green's getting, I haven't paid attention to it in specific, but we got to see how Reed Shepard can get to those looks. A lot of the plays I have in memory of him and Steven Adams interacting on screens has Reed trying to look for, instead of driving into space and then pulling up for the mid-range shot, of Reed trying to look for the three-point shot instead, which is fine. It's his strength. But, I mean, I guess so far in this preseason, his strength has been more of the mid-range than the pull-up three. But, just look to get him those exact kinds of looks, because he's money from mid-range. And the thing does not give itself the luxury of wasting perimeter scorers, because we don't have many, and we won't talk about Jalen Green because he's neither my bright spot nor my kind of point of concern. But getting Reed going would be huge. And
by the way, one last thing on Adams to close the loop. You can see the chemistry between him and Dillon going back to their Memphis days. And obviously Dillon's been a bright spot of the preseason. I don't know if you want to talk about him, but the chemistry between Dillon and Steven, that's another little thing that sort of adds to the whole package of why Steven's such a good fit. Go on.
Yeah, that's actually exactly who I was going to pick. For two reasons. The game against the Thunder, he took, some ill-advised shots, those mid-range off balance that he sometimes takes, which for the offensive standards that we had last season for the first half of the season were actually not bad, because we were so terrible at scoring, our guards were so terrible at scoring, that, Dillon Brooks was actually pretty efficient in comparison to the rest of the offense. So even though they weren't good looks, he was making them at a good enough pace that it kept us in some games. There were legit arguments between Jalen and Dillon Brooks at parts during the season where Dillon Brooks was contributing more offensively than Jalen was. But in this Pelicans game, I think he cleaned that up. He didn't force nearly as many shots. I thought he forced one weird post-up turnaround, really off balance down the baseline to the left, or to the right of the basket, to the left of the offensive team. That was really, really bad. But other than that, and obviously the threes are falling, which is a massive deal for him. Obviously, it trailed off after this injury to end the season, but he was a good 44% shooter for like half a season last season, and that was huge. But the more important thing for me with him is his defense has picked back up, and I was legit concerned because we saw the contract, we thought, that's a terrible contract, and that he played, not only up to it, but he exceeded expectations. He exceeded the value of the contract for half a season. Then he had that tough injury. I think it was a leg injury, if I'm not mistaken.
It was the oblique.
Oh, that's... Okay,
but it's midsection. It affects your ability to move side to side. Yeah.
And by the way, I have I have so little idea what an oblique is that I don't know what that means in Portuguese. So just so you know,
you see it much more in baseball. Last year, both Altuve and Jordan had it, but it's the midsection. It happens in baseball a lot because it's the muscles around your abdomen and your side that get used when you swing the bat. But also in a sport like basketball, where you move a lot laterally, it's tougher to strain, but when you do strain it, and I'm not sure how he did it, because again, it's not like he's swinging a bat, but when you do swing it, that's the kind of thing that, you feel if you're asked to move side to side the way defenders are laterally in the NBA.
Yeah, I knew it was, somewhere within, the abdominal area, but I didn't know what the actual muscle was. But this to say, Dillon last season obviously started off really well. We were all really excited, and then because of his reputation, I thought not a lot of people were highlighting that, from January on, his defense was taking a big nosedive. Like, he was getting beat off the dribble, he was gambling, and because he wasn't mobile enough, he wasn't able to, make the correct defensive rotations. That combined with a drop in efficiency, it really didn't look great to close the season.
Also, let me interject real quick. One stat that I looked up today that I think there could be a correlation beyond the injury, Dillon shot about 38% on threes through March 10th, and then the remainder of the season shot just about 30%, which dropped the season-long number to 36 or right below. And what happened on March 10th? That was the date of the Alperen Şengün injury. I do think that Dillon's a guy who disproportionately benefits from there being a little more structure, because he's not really a creator, so he needs his threes to be a little more set, a little more clean. And so I think he's someone that benefits from the Şengün offense, as opposed to post-Şengün, when it was more random and a little more freelancing. I think that's tougher on Dillon from an efficiency perspective, just because that's not stylistically where he's at his best in terms of just how he plays the game.
Yeah, and not only that, I think so. I think he's okay actually both catch and shoot and pull-ups, but on pull-ups, for them to work, he needs to do them really slowly and really set, like you said, and just having operation on the inside gives you, a couple of inches on the perimeter. Yeah, I think that really helps Dillon as well. I don't think it's just, the structure of the offense. I think it's actually, Sengun draws attention, even if it's, a guy being a step further back because they want to be ready to double team Sengun effectively or as quick as they can. And so I think that helps Dillon as well. But the most important thing that I wanted to talk about was his defense. He's looking, when he came in last year, it was night and day from, obviously we were used to the Stephen Silas teams, and it was night and day how good he was defensively, both at rotations, communication, just getting contests off. Even if he was beat, he would stay in place and get decent contests off. I think Ryan Hollins had a stat about that Dillon Brooks was the guy that put up the most contests in the league or something, or the most effective ones. I don't remember exactly what it was, but he said it last game. And this season, he's totally back to that. I think, in a team that has Amen Thompson, who's a great defender, and Tariq, and I think he's clearly our best defender. Just because of, I think maybe man-to-man, maybe man-to-man, goddamn, what am I talking about? Clearly one-on-one. He, Amen's maybe a little bit better because of how tall he is and how lengthy he is. But when you put together one-on-one, team defense, communication, rotations, I think Dillon Brooks is definitely our best defender. And he is back at that A+ level, where he's probably going to be the guy we put on the best player on every team again this season. But this time, unlike the back half of last season, he actually deserves it, and he did I think he did a tremendous job on Brandon Ingram. And listen, Brandon Ingram is someone who you can put up the best contest possible, and the shot can still go in because his arms are huge and he can shoot off balance and he can shoot off off of the backboard. He can shoot basically anything.
Right.
But he did make a few shots early on, but I thought that regardless of the outcome, Dillon was putting in really great contests, and so he's been my bright spot because, I know it's kind of boring for us as a podcast, probably for the listeners, because we're not talking about Jalen or
check the archives, but no, I get it.
Yeah, we're not talking about any of the young guys, but we're talking about two vets, Steven Adams and Dillon Brooks.
Yeah,
Dillon Brooks in specific, he has a 4-year contract. It's actually a pretty massive deal that he remains a valuable player at least through 3 years of that contract. Because if he were to fall off a cliff suddenly after the first season, that would actually be a pretty big problem.
Yeah, it would. And to your point on Dillon, I think there's a tendency for him to be undervalued because of those prospects. People are so eager to see the young guys like Amen, like Tari play more, that it's easy to play up the negatives of the veterans because you want to see them play more minutes, the younger guys, that is. But you don't want the veterans to be bad because, well, if you have too many good players, as I said during the Brook Lopez/Steven Adams discussion, that's a good problem to have. I mean, you can work that out later. Worst case, you've got a good trade asset that you can use as part of something down the line. But yeah, I think Dillon, just because it's easy to sort of make the case, why doesn't Men play 30 instead of 25 or Tari play 25 instead of 20 or whatever it is, then it's easy to look at the negatives of the veterans. But yeah, we should, when looking at a team that's truly about winning now, not saying that there's no development to it, but they are actively trying to win games at the highest level this year and should be able to play postseason basketball next spring, then yeah, that's a huge part of the equation. Dillon is in Ime's circle of trust. And that actually leads into my, area of concern might be too strong, but let's call it an area of further monitoring, which is Jabari Smith Jr. And it's correlated with the Dillon situation because if you noticed in that third game against the Pelicans, the closing lineup of the first half, and again, I think that Pelicans game, the exhibition, is probably the closest thing to a dress rehearsal that we'll see because of the timing of the fourth game being so close to the regular season and the opponent, the Spurs, who played them a ton early on. I suspect the Rockets won't treat that anywhere near as seriously. And so we know going into the year there's at least two guys on the bench, and Amen Thompson and Tari Eason, that are starting quality players that the Rockets want to play more. Maybe there's a third if Reed Shepherd as a rookie proves worthy of more minutes. I thought he's looked a lot better the last couple of games. But there's always this question of, okay, if they're going to play more minutes, if they're going to play the highest leverage minutes, like late in a half or late in a game alongside the other starters, who are they going to displace? For a lot of last season, for example, we saw Tari Eason actually, when he was healthy, displacing Jalen. However, I think the Rockets believe that Jalen going into year 4 is looking better, at a better spot in his career, so that's less likely to happen. Some people say Dillon, but number one, Dillon is just one guy, and you've got at least two on the bench that are worthy of starters minutes. And secondly, I think Dillon is clearly in Ime Udoka's circle of trust for the reasons that you just laid out, and he's playing very well. So if Jalen and Dillon are both better than we saw them for a lot of last season, and they are both earning the trust of Ime Udoka, side note, against the Pelicans, there were three guys who I saw Ime call a timeout to sort of chew out for defensive lapses: Alperen Sengun, Jabari Smith Jr., and Cam Whitmore. It was actually notable to me that in a game where Ime was clearly trying to set a tone and taking it seriously, he never chewed out Jalen Green, who was a guy that a year ago he actually chewed out a decent bit. And so I think that reflects Jalen, becoming more professional, a lot of the stuff that we talked about on last week's pod. But in terms of Jabari, look, I said that on last week's show, I don't think that the preseason format is suited for him because he's more of a half-court guy, and these games can be a little bit more ragged, and it's not like that there's been no improvement. For example, he had 5 assists against the Pelicans. That showed a little bit more vision and playmaking. His defense has been okay. He does look stronger, and even though his stats haven't been good, look, he's just missing shots. As soon as the shot luck turns, and he had a good shooting season last year, he's high IQ, he's going to be a very solid player. So I'm not saying that Jabari is looking bad by any means. It's not that. However, just as this time a year ago, we heard from John Lucas, former assistant coach now in the front office, that it was probably year 4, not year 3, that Jalen was going to take the leap, so to speak. It just sort of feels like, from watching this team, that a year from now is more likely than now that Jabari takes that leap into, let's call it, Paolo Banchero superstardom or stardom, because I don't know if Paolo's truly a superstar. I think that's the guy that obviously Rockets fans compare Jabari to, same draft class, and because most of the time people expected Banchero to the Rockets, including, I know it's a sore subject for you, Paolo, but I just think, Jabari, and this is not just based on watching a few preseason games, this is also based on, some off-the-record conversations I've had with people inside the building at Toyota Center. They'll point out that they are very bullish on his long-term future, but they will also caution you that he's one of the youngest guys in his entire draft class. In fact, even though we think of Amen as a lot newer, because in terms of NBA experience, he is drafted in 2023, Amen's actually several months older than Jabari. So Jabari is still very young. He's still growing into somewhat of a new body compared to how he played at Auburn and in high school. And so there's just a lot of things for Jabari to sort of get accustomed to. And so I want to be cautious when I say this. I don't think that his game is comparable to Jalen a year ago because the formula for Jalen is inherently more volatile. Jabari, the floor is a lot higher. He will make an impact with his defense and shooting. But I think Jabari is closer to year 3 Jalen than he is to year 3 Sengun in terms of, is he going to make a leap into, all-star considerations. I think, the Rockets aren't going to foreclose that possibility, neither am I, but I think it's something that they're not counting on. If something like that happens, you take that as a pleasant surprise. I think the Rockets are counting on, a little bit of growth from Jabari, but nothing major. And if that's the case, if Jalen is a lot better in year 4 and Dillon is healthy, then Jabari might be the guy who, as we saw against the Pelicans, gets booted from the lineup at times if Amen or Tari has it going on a given night. And that's not necessarily the end of the world. Jabari's a young guy. He knows that. They're all competing for minutes. And you could argue that from a business standpoint, maybe that's even better for the Rockets, because if Jabari doesn't break out until year 4 or year 5, then maybe when he's extension eligible next summer, the Rockets can get him on a cheaper rate and lock him up long-term. He ends up outperforming his contract, and it becomes easier to keep the entire young core together. That's the optimistic scenario. So, Paolo, I know you want to jump in on the business angle.
Yeah, just really quick. I think you make a really good point on that, because there's a very big difference between, extending Sengun early and extending Jabari early, which is, listen, if you can get to, if because Jabari was benched or isn't, a starter, makes him, take a $17 to $20 million a year deal on the long term, that's not nearly as risky for the Rockets as somebody like Şengün or Jalen is, just because the floor is a lot higher. Listen, Jabari is going to be useful for any team that we build. If he is, if he just gets 20% better at shooting and not 20% shooting percentage, but at shooting and defense than what he is right now, and he'll be a very valuable role player for his entire career. It's perfectly fine to extend him on going into his third year. If you can get good value, it's not as boom or bust as not really Şengün, but more Jalen is. And so I think you make a really good point. I'd be really willing to explore a Jabari extension next offseason, especially if those circumstances that you're saying, fruition.
And it might make sense to explore a Tari extension as well, because if Tari's minutes are artificially capped a little bit, both in terms of coming off the bench and the leg issue, then you might get him for cheaper than his rate if and when he becomes a full-fledged starter in a year or two. So both of those guys, unlike Jalen and Şengün, you could be in a situation with both Jabari and Tari to where you can get them a little bit below what their actual rate would be if another team was playing them, 35 minutes per game and letting them ball out, so to speak. Anyway, I don't say any of that to be negative on Jabari, because I still believe in the guy long-term, and so do the Rockets. I think of all the young guys, Jabari is the guy that the Rockets probably feel is the safest. Like, they would be shocked if he's not at least a top 50 player 4 or 5 years from now, maybe even a top 30 player. So it's not that they don't believe in him, and I certainly do as well. It's just, when does the larger leap take place? Is it this year or next? And I don't think, even if it takes until a year or two from now, I don't think Jabari is the type of guy who's going to let it affect his confidence. He's a very hard-nosed grinder type. He's going to take it as a challenge. And so I'm not so much worried about him specifically and his development. However, what it means for the team is that if he's the guy who goes out, he's the one guy in that starting lineup who actually has above average height and length for his position. So it was very noticeable against the Pelicans. If you have Fred, Jalen, Dillon, Amen, and it was basically Amen at the 4 operating something out of the dunker slot, it felt a little bit like the end of last season, because even though Şengün was out there in a way that he wasn't to end last year, Şengün could often operate beyond the 3-point line, high post, so you can still have Amen either in the corner or out of the dunker slot, something like that, and doing a lot of stuff off ball. So the offense didn't necessarily function all that differently than when we saw Amen late last season. But when there's no Jabari, the lack of length becomes very glaring. And so Fred is one of the smaller guys at his position. Jalen, a little undersized. Fred and Dillon aren't very explosive. Şengün is explosive in some ways, but not as much in others. And so I do worry if Jabari's minutes take a little bit of a hit based on trying to get, more Amen and Tari. And unlike last year, Jalen isn't the guy that gets pulled as much. Then do the Rockets suffer a little bit against teams that are, bigger or longer? Or I guess conversely, does Jabari maybe not take as much of a hit because they need his length? I don't know. It's just an extra consideration. It felt notable to me because I think for a few reasons, Jabari might be the easiest of the 5 to remove in ways that for last year, it was largely Jalen, occasionally Dillon. But there is sort of a length and athleticism component to think of as well. People don't think of Jabari as a top shelf athlete because he's not the most explosive, but he is very long, very agile for his position, can occupy a lot of space. And so that's just a little thing to think about. Not a major concern. It's a good problem to have because you can sort of mix and match the lineups. But it's just something that, when I was looking at the minutes and thinking who might go out in order to get Amen and Tari, those high leverage reps that I know a lot of people want, Jabari could be a guy based on what I've seen. Again, not too negative on him. It just doesn't look like to me by the eye test that he's going to take a massive leap, at least not right away. I would love to be wrong on that, but I just think there's some interesting implications that potentially come from that. So that's my sort of area of concern. Paolo, what were you thinking in terms of that lens?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment because what you just said about the height, I've seen a lot of people say it, and obviously everybody agrees that the league's getting smaller and smaller. So actually, I just looked up the average NBA height by position, and just quickly, the one I got was from 2022. For point guards, it's 6'2.5". For shooting guards, it's 6'4.5". So Jalen is the average.
I thought.
Shooting.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. And obviously, Jalen is an explosive athlete, so is Amen, so that sort of offsets it a little bit.
Yeah, I think small forwards, we are honestly concerned. It's 6'6.5". I think Dillon is 6'6", if I'm not mistaken. and power forward is 6'8", and 6'8.2", which, Tari is 6'8", I'm pretty sure. So we'd actually, if Tari is the one that slots in, we'll actually probably be fine height-wise. We'll still obviously be outmatched because, we aren't playing the average team every game. So we're going to be out.
Right.
The Pelicans, besides their center, are a pretty big team. And I also, we wanted to use the opportunity to say that I genuinely think that Dillon looks bigger this year. And I mean, taller as well.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, maybe it's because he's bulky, he looks bigger than therefore looks taller. I think the first 2 seasons, to me, he clearly looked 6'4". He doesn't look 6'4" to me right now.
Interesting.
But whatever. That's just off of feel. Obviously, I have no proof to back this up. But I'll transition into my kind of, area for concern, which is not really too concerning, especially because it kind of makes the decisions easier for Ime Udoka, but Cam Whitmore has not been great. Shooting a lot, not making them. When he was promoted from the D-League last season, he came in, really hot, gave us a scoring punch that we really needed. But right now, both offensively and defensively, I'm just, not sold. I don't know if anybody told him that it was unlikely that he was going to get a big role, and maybe he's just, he's increasing the variance. Hey, maybe if I make a lot of shots, they will be able to, they'll have to give me a role, and so I'm going to shoot a lot. He also shot a lot last year, so doesn't make too much sense to say it's because of it. But he hasn't been great. And I was really hopeful for him to become a Dillon Brown type. And obviously, he's plenty young. I think he's 19 still. So obviously it's fine. But if I had to pinpoint something that's not been going as great, first would be Jabari. I would agree with you. But since you took that one, I would go with Cam, and I'm pretty confident that he'll see some G-League time this season again.
Yeah. And I was having the conversation with someone in the building this week, and they made the point, and I think they're probably right, that the presence of Reed artificially makes, or well, not artificially, it's just sort of a byproduct of having both those guys playing at largely the same time. It makes some of Cam's shortcomings more apparent, because Reed is someone who, even for a rookie, is so advanced in terms of his processing. Fred said post-game that he's already one of the best guys in terms of how he reads the floor and the decisions that he can make. And so having him on the same unit with Cam coming off the bench and seeing what Reed does contrasted against Cam in terms of just the decision-making. And we all know that as the rotation tightens, those guys are going to be somewhat in competition with each other for playing time. It does make some of the middle things with Cam stand out a little more. And that was this person's point. It's not so much to say that Cam can't overcome them, because obviously he's way bigger, he's way more athletic, he can do things in transition that Reed can, never dream of doing. So it's different skill sets. However, in terms of, let's call it being raw, the processing side of Cam's game and the decision making, then that stands out a little bit more when there's another young guy that he's somewhat in competition with for minutes that is a little bit sharper. And so that's not so much to say that Cam can't overcome it, but it's a new challenge for him in a way that wasn't there last year, because there wasn't another young guy competing for the same minutes that also has high upside, but is a lot more advanced as a processor. All right, I'll use that to transition into the rapid fire notes as we close out the pod. With Reed, we said this last week when he had a subpar game in Utah. It was just because the shots didn't go in and a little bit of nerves with him playing his first game. He's looked very, very good the last 2. And in large part, I think it's that contrast we just described against Cam Whitmore. Reed just looks beyond what he can do in terms of his passing and his shooting. He just always makes the right plays, gets guys the ball in the right spots. And defensively, even when he gets caught against bigger guys on switches, he has the IQ, the hands. We saw him rip Brandon Ingram yesterday. It's very reminiscent of Fred VanVleet. There's a reason people keep making that comparison. And just as Fred's limited size doesn't often hurt him as a defender because he's so smart and anticipates to overcome it, the same holds true with Reed as well. So very encouraged by Reed, and I think it's pretty clear that he's ahead of Aaron Holiday in the hierarchy. We noted that at last week's show that it's definitely held up. Reed Shepherd will be in the rotation when the season opens next Wednesday. That's 100% a done deal, assuming health, in my opinion. Beyond that, it's been interesting for Jalen Green. We talked about him in the last week's show. The first game, he came out red hot, and it felt like a continuation of March. The last couple of games, he's been a little bit more in a supporting role. They've run more offense through Şengün. Even though Şengün didn't get a ton of shot attempts against the Pelicans, I felt like he did get a lot of offense run through him. It just so happened that the Pelicans, chose to double and trap and do a lot of things early in the shot clock. And so Jalen was sort of a secondary release valve. And we saw him doing, I compare it to CJ Stroud, just taking what the defense gives him. And it didn't feel like that a year ago. It felt like a year ago, Jalen was either boom or bust. He was used a very specific way, and either he would go off as the focal point of the offense or he would retreat. We've seen him play with a little more discipline this preseason in that he's made some catch and shoots, but beyond that, okay, he's willing to sort of bide his time. And then when there's a switch or the defense is scrambling, when he gets a big on him, the way, the drive in the third quarter last night when he had that great footwork against Jeremiah Robinson Earl, he was just very patient and attacked the rim. And when there was a mismatch, he attacked. It doesn't feel like he's forcing the issue nearly to the extent that it was last year, which often made his game very boom or bust. Do the step back threes go in? Do they not? And if they don't, well, it takes a toll on everything else. It feels like a more calm, a more mature, more patient Jalen Green. Is that going to lead to him being a superstar? I don't know about that, but it significantly increases the floor. So Reed and Jalen are two that I felt pretty good about. Jalen and Paolo, any thoughts on Jalen? I know he's someone you're watching closely, and any other guys that you're watching on the roster.
Jalen, as I said, I'm neither up nor down with what I've seen from him this far. It's been inconsistent. I think you can claim that, he's shooting with different confidence, or he's, not as boom or bust or whatever it is. To me, it's just too small of a sample. I've been hurt too many times to start believing again.
And let me throw in the obvious disclaimer that we did at the front of last week's pod. But yes, we know it's a small sample. It's just all we have. So that's why we're making a big deal out of this. Proceed.
Yep. I'm in wait and see mode with everything. I'm more willing to overreact to all the other guys. I would point out, it seems like Fred VanVleet's shot diet is a lot different. So obviously, a lot different. He's not playing as many minutes as he was last season, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But he took 7 shots on 24 minutes last game. He took, I think, 2 shots or something ridiculous like that in 15 minutes against Utah. Just something to look out for. If we saw a lot of Fred Şengün pick and roll that generated a lot of shots for Fred. Obviously because the rest of the offense was so bad that, it was our last resort a lot of times. But seeing how Fred's used within the offense is something that I'm looking for.
Although I will say the ball movement really suffered that game that Fred sat out in Oklahoma City. It was very apparent that, people love to call him the training wheels for the offense. Yeah, they're not so advanced, the perimeter guys, that they don't need the training wheels, especially against a really good team like Oklahoma City. So I thought that game, even though the shots haven't gone down, you mentioned the shot diet changing, that's all true. But in terms of the ball movement, the initiation, Fred's still very important.
Well, yeah, I'm 100% with you. I'm not saying he's,
right.
not as important. I'm just saying he might be important in different ways this season. He might be more of the training wheels and less of the hard carry that he had to be at points during last season. Ime Udoka said that we could see some of the rotation patterns, obviously not specifically these words, but he said we'd see some of what the rotation would look like in this game against the Pelicans, if I'm not mistaken. You can confirm this, right, Ben?
No, he did, but it didn't quite feel like it felt like more just full-blown line changes. There were a couple of minutes here or there where he played Fred and Reed together and it looked good, but it wasn't sustained. Like there were just very brief stretches. For the most part, it felt like, that was a little overblown. He was just trying to do line changes and, just a dabble of something here or there.
Yeah, so the only thing that I was going to take away from it wasn't, I didn't pay too much attention to the exact lineups we saw, just because, listen, it's one preseason game, and within the preseason game, guys are playing 22 to 25 minutes, the main guys, so you can't really tell any patterns. I was only going to mention that, and these games are late for me. Hopefully I didn't mess this up, but I'm pretty sure Jeff Green played in the first half, and that was something that I noticed.
He did.
I was paying attention to...
Yeah.
I was paying attention to the guys who, since I was trying to pay attention to the rotations, it was very, very confusing, but something that did stand out was within the first half.
Speaking of, so when Jeff came in, there was very briefly, now again, all this stuff was like 2-3 minutes. It wasn't sustained, but there was actually a lineup with Jabari at the 3. They brought in Steven Adams and Jeff Green as the backup 4 and 5. Or no, actually, Steven Adams was in, so they brought Şengün back. So it was Şengün, Jeff Green, Jabari at the 3, and Reed and Cam as the backcourt. And it went okay. I think they did it because like Brandon Ingram is a type of three that Jabari is fluid enough that he can, handle really well. So the matchup was there. But yeah, just the fact that they're willing to use Jabari in that way was sort of interesting. So maybe, who knows, maybe that's a way that Jabari can sneak a few extra minutes here or there.
Yeah, and so I just wanted to note that, there's a possibility that Jeff Green is a part of the rotation in this.
Although keep in mind there was no Tari Eason in that game, so that's another thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, I guess that's the reason. Because, in my mind, I don't really view them as competing for minutes, but considering what you just
said. But they sort of are. And to your larger point, Jeff Green is still in the circle of trust. Even if he doesn't regularly play, I do think it shows you that he's still a circle of trust guy for Ime Udoka.
Yeah, 100%. And then my last note would be, I'm not seeing too much difference in the way we're running offense. There was a couple of different looks to what we did last season with Steven Adams, in the Steven Adams minutes. But other than that, I didn't see anything too groundbreaking. I was expecting that to be more kink in the way that we run the offense, especially more Shingun-centric stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, he was getting double-teamed a lot, so it's hard to say. It's obviously going to be matchup dependent because, you can't play through the post against every team in the league. But I'll highlight that play. I guess I'll highlight two plays, two from Amen Thompson. The give and go with, not really give and go, but, Adams, sets the screen, gets the ball, passes on the short roll to Amen Thompson, who's driving to the rim. That was really cute. And then the three that Amen, it's not back to back, but within the same minute possessions. Amen took a very confident three from the top of the pipeline and drilled it. So obviously, really small sample size, but something to look out for.
Speaking of small samples, Alperen Sengun 18 of 20 from the free throw line, and he talked about in an interview with I believe it's Adam Spillane that had this back and forth with him, in which Sengun said he worked a lot with Cam Hodges in the offseason, Rockets assistant coach, typically on that and getting his mechanics right, having his shoulder adjusted relative to last year. And so it's not just flukish, even though it is a small sample, when it's something that was a point of emphasis in the offseason as well. That leads me to believe there could be something there as well. Not saying he's going to shoot 90%, but even if he could just bump the 69% from a year ago to a more nice 75 to 80%, that would mean a lot for the Rockets as a team and the way this offense functions. The last guy I want to throw a shout out to, because there could be some roster implications, Jason Tate in a small sample has looked really good. Last night he was a plus 16 in 7 minutes, I believe, and well, we know his story. He's a high IQ guy. He's good at defense. He's just blocked here in terms of a path to minutes. He's entering the last year of his contract. I do wonder if there's a small chance that maybe a deal pops up over the next week or so as teams are starting to finalize their rosters, because he could help a lot of teams. There's just no pathway here, assuming health or anything close to health. And unlike guys with larger salaries, there's some guys like Jeff Green and Jacques Landale, they're close to $10 million a year, and there's options in Landale's case beyond this season that make it to where you need them for flexibility down the line. Tate, in the final year of his existing deal at a smaller, I think it's 6-point-something million, there's not that much of a hit to your flexibility if you lose him. It just comes down to, do you get offered sufficient value in a deal? And so with him playing well, I'm sure other teams are watching film as they try and set their rosters. I do wonder if maybe there's a deal. It wouldn't be anything major, but if you can get a second-round pick or two and replenish your stockpile a little bit, maybe that's something the Rockets should consider.
How about a different deal? I mean, I wouldn't mind giving him the same contract he got. It's a 3-year. Deal. Last year's a team option. Second year's non-guaranteed. You keep him as a
human.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He's a great culture guy. Probably a great guy to have in practice, just due to how many different positions he can defend and be tough at defending. Can play multiple positions if injuries, do come up. I've not been shy in saying that he's frustrating when he plays, because sometimes he has tunnel vision, sometimes he unnecessary fouls, the subpar shooting, but you're not gonna roster spots 12 through 15 in the NBA are the standard really isn't that high. So right. as the team.
Yeah, and I know he's worked on his shooting. It has looked better, albeit the obvious asterisk, very small sample. So it's just something I'm monitoring. Again, it's not that the Rockets are desperate to move him. They don't need to be. He could be an asset as insurance, as salary filler down the line. However, if something pops up over the next week as teams are getting more serious about setting their rosters, I could see the Rockets exploring it, because just from a math perspective, he's not as essential to keep around as the other guys, and he is a little bit blocked.
And and I'm just gonna throw this into the ether. Not really sure if this something that can be done or not. But so 22, 23, he had 2 years left on his deal back then. Okay, I was wondering if something like what happened with Miles Turner could be done, where you renegotiate it, you inflate how much he's making this year, you pay him a lot this year, since you're probably not going to use the space anyways, not the space, but you need cap space. That's right.
Yeah, I think that's it. We can ask David Weiner to confirm once we post the episode, but yeah, I think you're right. I think that's what was different about that.
And the Pacers had a cap space. That's how they did it. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can do it. That's what I was missing, but the idea would be that.
Yeah, the larger point, it's a week in which maybe the Rockets could be creative because he's showing he can play. There's just no path to playing time here. So who knows? Maybe that presents, sort of an interesting leverage point that something could happen. Stay tuned. Roster cuts around the NBA are due, I believe, Monday, a couple of days before the regular season starts. That's also the extension deadline for potential contracts with fourth-year players ahead of their restricted free agency. In Houston, obviously, that's Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun as we're recording now. There isn't a deal with either of those guys. Obviously, our next episode will know the resolution, so we'll talk more about that once we see what happens at that deadline on the 21st, but that's also the roster deadline, so we'll see what happens with Jae'Sean Tate and a few other situations around the NBA as well. Not saying that Tate could be a roster cut, he absolutely will not be, but just that the process might open up some opportunities, and so the Rockets may have some creative things that Rafael Stone can consider. Anyway, I think that's where we'll wrap it for today. And if you want more content before that next show, which should be, again, after that October 21st deadline, unless there's breaking news before then the best place to get it before is, of course, online, where you can follow me on Twitter or X at Ben Dubose, at Palo Alves NBA, and this show at The Logger Line, where if you go to the Logger Line's page, you can find our link tree. That's got links to our distribution partners, Apple, Google, Spotify. If you'd be kind enough to subscribe, leave a positive review at your location of choice. Obviously, we would greatly appreciate that. And also on that same link tree, you can find links to friends, sponsors, partners of the program, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Carbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790. Hit up those links and you can enjoy their content as well. All right, with those plugs complete, we'll adjourn for today. For Paolo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line.